So welcome to a Veritas Forum, conversation on science, neuroscience, and faith. I'm Jack Mann. I'm a sophomore here at ASU studying economics. And before we get going and introduce tonight's very special guest, I just want to give you some background on what the Veritas Forum is and how tonight's event came about. So Veritas, as you know, means truth in Latin. And the Veritas Forum is a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping students at some of the world's leading universities confront life's hardest questions by placing the Christian faith in dialogue with other beliefs and systems of thought. The first forum was planned by students, faculty, and chaplains at Harvard University in 1992. Since then, over 200 universities in North America and Europe have hosted over 2,000 forums. The first forum here at ASU took place 21 years ago in February of 1997. The next one happened in 2007, the next in 2015, and from then on there's been one every year at ASU, so we're on sort of a roll, and you can look forward to many more to come. Tonight specifically is the result of a collaboration between over 20 campus ministry groups here at ASU. You can find a list of those in the program, and I apologize, we have more people than I think we were expecting, so not everybody received a program. Now, if you did receive something from the ushers, you should have gotten a response card. If you wouldn't mind, we'd really appreciate it if you were able to fill that out. And if you enter your email on it, you'll get an email from the Veritas Forum, and you'll be able to enter to have a chance at winning an iPad. So moderating tonight will be Hannah Parmalee. Mrs. Parmalee is a campus minister with Oasis Campus Ministry and Outreach of the Tempe Church of Christ. She received a bachelor's in psychology from Pepperdine University and a master's in marriage and family therapy from Fuller Theological Seminary. Before coming to Tempe, Mrs. Parmalee served as the director of Relationship IQ at the Boone Center for the Family at Pepperdine University, where she helped organizations of all sorts teach young adults about how to foster healthy, godly relationships. She and her husband, Jay, have been married since 2002, and they have 3 young daughters. So without further ado, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Mrs. Hannah Parmalee.
Thank you, Jack. I appreciate it. Well, I too want to extend my welcome to ASU Veritas. I'm so glad to be with you here tonight and to get to participate in this discussion together. A conversation on science, neuroscience, and faith. What a great place to be tonight. I'm glad that we're here together. Tonight, we ask neuroscience insiders their meaningful understandings of how the brain responds and impacts us. We're going to talk about the mind-body connection, how beliefs matter and influence our brains, moral decision-making, free will, and how we expand rigid thinking to experience choice. Just a few small topics tonight. This is not going to be a theological conversation, but rather a conversation about neuroscience with Christians. C.S. Lewis said, "The world does not need more Christian literature. What it needs is more Christians writing good literature." Tonight we have with us 2 neuroscientists who have thought deeply about their fields, and they are Christians. They do not agree on everything, so tonight they'll offer you a civil dialogue and conversations about things that they do agree about and things that they don't. We hope that you will experience in this conversation freedom to lean into big questions, that you will ask the deeper why questions that we have, and that you will consider the glorious complexity of our good God. So let me introduce to you our amazing speakers, and I've gotten to spend a good part of today with them, and I am so impressed with these men, and I'm very excited for you to get to hear from them. As we were sitting and talking earlier today about what they would talk about tonight, there was parts of their conversation and dialogue with each other. They'd just get off on one of these topics. I just sit there nodding, but they have some wonderful things to share with you. So Dr. William Newsome is a very prominent scientist. He's world-renowned for his work in neuroscience. He's a member of the National Academy of Science. He's an honored professor at Stanford University in neurobiology. He's the founder of Stanford's Neuroscience Institute, and he's been co-chair of the U.S. National Brain Initiative, which was a huge national project in mapping the brain. He's also a very kind man, I've come to know today. He's also a father and a follower of Jesus. And Dr. Carreon studied civil engineering at UCLA and psychiatry and neuroscience at Stanford Medical School, where he's also finishing his residency in psychiatry. His research has focused on willpower and top-down control, as well as brain imaging of executive function and mental illness. Clinically, he is working on developing holistic treatments and finding better ways to help patients who are depressed thrive with their body and their brain and their soul. He loves teaching, nonprofit work, including a year in Kenya, and excessively long conversations over brunch, as well as podcasting. If you're interested in podcasts, you can find them at psyched.space. So tonight, we have the pleasure of hearing from David first, and then Bill, and then after that, I'm going to change the slide so you can see. We're going to have a time of Q&A. And so these are some different ways that you can text your questions in or hashtag them on social media. Are we doing the hashtag, Jenna? Just Twitter. Okay. Or you can Twitter. What's the hashtag? Hashtag ASU Veritas. So you can tweet or text in your questions, and we'll get to those after we hear from David and Bill. So let's give them a warm welcome.
All right. Well, thank you guys for having us out. I'm really excited about giving this talk, and I'm glad that so many of you are interested in science, neuroscience, and faith. I was just talking to Bill earlier about what a strange time it is that hundreds of people want to hear about these like weird topics about brains and such that are kind of special interests. But yeah, so it is, and we're going to give you our perspective on how these things interact. But before we do too much of that, I want to give some preliminary comments on science before we talk too much about the neuroscience side of things. As this is often a barrier for a lot of people before they even walk in the door about neuroscience. Can a scientist really be religious? So these things are thought to be opposite directions in conflict. I'm not going to talk too much about this question other than to say that is a minority opinion. You might not get that from listening to popular sources, but the majority of the population, majority of scientists that they surveyed in this particular study suggested that these are two independent domains. They're two different ways of knowing things, and only 29% believed that there was a conflict between science and faith fundamentally. So that's one thing to say, like, yes, it's an interesting topic, and Veritas Forum has all sorts of topics. Also, you can Google this. There's just dozens and dozens of talks on this subject. The other thing to note is that while there is a difference in the United States between those who the general population identifying as slightly, moderately, or very religious, and that scientists are lower, that number's not zero. The other thing to note is that there's some interesting cross-cultural comparisons that in some places scientists are more religious than the general population. So the general conflict hypothesis has a number of points that are not accounted for. But I'll put that away. Bill will say a few more things about that later. But Let's talk about the topic of free will. I mean, this is a gigantic question, and one of the things I've been interested in personally, clinically, in my own life. What is it? Do we have it? How do we wrestle with these questions? But do we have the ability to make choices in any sort of meaningful sense? That is one of the things that we're going to be addressing today. So I've got 3 points to make. Number one, there are several philosophical views on how free will works. There's no neuroscience evidence that disproves free will, and top-down causality is experimentally validated. And I'll say more about what that is, but the basic idea of beliefs or values or things that are on this high level of neurological processing, those things matter and exist as experimental constructs as well. So, first, several philosophical views on how free will works. Okay, so let's start off with this question. I think that to start off the question of free will, I think that trying to find some example of where is this, what can we look at? And I think that moral decision-making is a great place to look. There's all sorts of experimental constructs, but from a philosophical standpoint, what is the difference between saying that you should love your neighbor and saying that you should eat your neighbor? Is there a difference between these two things? Now, of course, we'd want to say that this is the good person and Hannibal Lecter is the bad person, and that we want to be more like her and less like him, hopefully, and that's like what we're going for. But how can we meaningfully make decisions in this area, and what does it even mean to make a moral decision? So I'm going to give you one construct of how this could happen, and I wanted to use a concrete example. This is William F. Buckley, a prominent conservative commentator who's got a very smug look on his face in this particular 1957 photo. William F. Buckley said this in 1957, on segregation, the white community is so entitled to it because for the time being, it is the advanced race. So a rather racist comment, and we might say that it's partly his dopamine that's causing that, or maybe it's his mother coming from Louisiana. Maybe we can say that there's sort of cultural influences there, or perhaps it's his white race, or maybe even it's his class. He was from an upper class family. Maybe these things influenced him to be a racist or to make a racist comment. So then the civil rights movement comes, Martin Luther King Jr. comes, and he says, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. All right, so one way we could analyze this, and Bill's going to talk a lot more about this in his talk, is that we could go down. We could say, let's just break that down, and we can learn more about what Martin Luther King is saying. We could look at the word laws. How does it sound? What is it from? What language does it derive from? We could study the physics of it. We could study the physics of the sound vibrations. We could study the ear. We could study the neural conduction. None of these things is helping us understand Martin Luther King Jr. We have to go in the other direction. We have to go up. So one thing we could say is, okay, well, let's study American jurisprudence. But there again, we come up with a problem because that's exactly what he's saying we should not be doing. We should be doing something other than following the law. What he's doing is he's pointing to something above the law. He's pointing to this thing and expecting people like Buckley to also be able to see the thing he's pointing at. But that's very strange. It's a very strange thing to be able to do. And the story has a happy ending. William F. Buckley does actually change his tune in the 1960s and becomes an advocate of the civil rights movement and a proponent of making Martin Luther King Jr. Day a national holiday, which successfully. So when you take that day off, know that people have changed their minds, and it's a beautiful thing. It's a wonderful part of the human condition to change one's mind. All right, but that's weird. How do you change your mind? So we agree that there are things like photons. Like a photon will start here at the sun, and it will travel. And we've got receptors. We've got a retina. We've got a brain that's able to interpret photons. That all makes sense. That we can say that there's evolutionary advantages to being able to see light and photons and be able to detect them accurately. That's all great. We all agree on that. But what is this? Like, what is it that Martin Luther King Jr. was pointing at? And then how is it that anybody is able to see that? That kind of stuff. We might say that it's evolutionarily, is matter the kind of stuff that can be just? That's a difficult question. And so, we might say that yes, there's evolutionary advantages to being able to talk about justice. We can form better societies. We can build we can get together as larger groups of primates to outcompete other groups of primates if we have this concept of justice. But still doesn't answer the question, how exactly can matter do that? We might say that it would be evolutionarily advantageous to be able to teleport like the mutant Nightcrawler from X-Men. But matter doesn't seem to be able to teleport, and so this is a comic book, and it's a great comic book or movie, but that's what it is. So this brings us to the mind-body problem, which again is going to have to be treated very briefly as I focus on the actual applications of these things. First off, most people agree that there is a problem. Not everybody, though. This is also interesting. That some people think that there's no problem here at all. That it's hotly debated. There's all sorts of fun discussions that are happening, and it's actually kind of complicated. So if there's any quick dismissals of this problem, it probably means that it hasn't been thought through very deeply. It's a hard thing that people have been wrestling with for centuries and continue to wrestle with. So let's just start there. Now, what is the mind-body problem? I think that it's best illustrated by this comic. Get up, says the mind. No, says the body. Who's ever been there? Has anybody ever been in a position like this before? This is part of the human condition. So it's a joke, but it's not really a joke. I mean, it's weird. It's weird that we can have part of ourself that wants to do something and another part of ourself that doesn't want to do things. What sort of a creature is it that disagrees with itself? It raises big questions. Okay, so there's some technical words here, but physicalism. If you survey, there's a fascinating survey done by Dave Chalmers where you actually survey philosophers. What do you believe about these things? The answer for almost all questions was philosophers believe all manner of things. And that some of them are intuitive and some of them are not intuitive, but it illustrates how big a debate is going on right now at very least. And so right now, a small majority believe in physicalism. In other words, there's nothing else to the human mind. There is no other stuff in the human mind besides matter. But a significant minority believe in non-physicalism. There's some other kind of stuff. Some people will call this dualism, or that's one direction. But a decent number of people believe in that. As far as free will, there's much more consensus, almost more than most subjects in philosophy. 73% of people believe in some version of free will, and only 12% think that there is no such thing as free will. So this is where the philosophical debate stands. To elaborate just a little bit more, humans seem to have two kinds of properties. One, physical, and two, mental. Physical properties are public, equally observable by anyone. Mental properties are private, only observable by the subject. So for example, a public thing about me is that I am 6 foot tall. You could know that, I could know that, we equally know that I am 6 feet tall. How am I feeling right now? You could measure, how much am I sweating? How fast's my heart going? That's not the same thing as my subjective experience standing here looking at this audience. There is something that it is like to be David Carreon speaking to a Veritas forum that's different. And so this is a private property. And so there's a question of how do you reconcile these two things? They seem very different. And how do you, as a scientist, approach the private ones when in principle you can't? This is part of the problem. Now, there have been various formulations of trying to solve this problem, and I'm just going to list them here to say that this is an interesting thing for further study and reflection. These are example views. There's many more than these, but I just kind of picked these out as some of the more common ones I've heard. Reductive physicalism says there is no soul, that it's all matter, and not just that it's all matter, but anything that you say is that is important, that's above matter, isn't actually real, or isn't really significant, or is an epiphenomenon, some version of that. That the significant stuff that we talk about, beliefs, values, desires, those aren't really real in the ability to cause things other than the bottom levels. Non-reductive physicalism says, more or less, the soul is the exact same thing as the brain. It doesn't mean that there's not those things, but looking at the bottom level only, you're losing information. Thomistic dualism says that the soul correlates with the brain while on Earth. So the idea that anything you do to the brain, you do to the mind, and anything you do to the mind, you do to the brain. But it allows for things like disembodiment upon death, that you'll be sort of a handicapped human while you're disembodied awaiting a resurrection for St. Thomas. Platonic Cartesian dualism is on the other extreme, says the soul is separate from the brain but interacts with it. That's pretty cool. But it really raises the problem of, okay, how exactly does that happen if it's not material? But in any case, these are 4 example views. I encourage you to look into them. All right. No neuroscience evidence disproves free will. This is Charles Whitman. In 1966, he climbed a bell tower at University of Texas and killed 17 people with an arsenal he brought up there. Now, a lot of people say, wow, what a terrible person, what a criminal, what a villain. But they autopsied his brain at his request. He knew something was up. He said, "You need to autopsy my brain." They autopsied his brain and found a tumor pressing on part of the area that's involved with emotional control and generating emotions. And so we say, oh, well, that's not his responsibility. He just had a tumor. Now, some people raise the question, okay, that's great, but don't we all just have something in our brain like a tumor, maybe a little more complicated than a tumor, that's causing us to do the same things that Charles Whitman did, but with a little bit less dramatic size? And I think in a similar vein of argument, who's ever seen No Country for Old Men? Oh my gosh, like terrifying movie. But this is, I read an article about this is the best portrayal of a psychopath in film. I'm not sure if that's true, but in any case, psychopaths. So psychopaths are presumably people who don't feel empathy, who don't have the capacity to be moral. What about them? Could it be that there are such people out there? And would that disprove the idea that we have free will? Aren't we all just differing degrees of sociopath? And I think the answer to both of these questions is no. Okay, so you all see, but if you get a tumor in the wrong part of your brain, you're not going to be able to see anymore. That doesn't mean that there's no such thing as vision. Like the fact that the brain systems can go awry, and then you don't have the functions that were underlied by the brain system that went awry, doesn't mean that there wasn't the thing in the first place. And I think that there's a leap to say, well, if you assume that you're a reductive materialist or something, then yeah, of course you're going to come up with that conclusion that we're all just sort of versions of sociopaths at varying degrees of a knob. But I don't think that that's true at all, and I also think there's all sorts of experimental problems with sociopaths. I'm quite skeptical of the construct, but that's for a different lecture. All right. Last but not least, top-down causality is experimentally validated. So by top-down, I mean more or less directed attention. So when you direct your attention in a particular way, it has consequences, and there's different ways to do that. And so one of the most, I think, clever experimental ways of doing this, this is a large literature in non-human primates in studying directed attention to change parts of the brain. But check this out. So this is your abductor digiti minimi, one of the most easily isolated muscles in the body, very small, usually not very practiced, and usually not very exercised. I don't tend to exercise that muscle myself when I go to the gym. But, okay, so let's look at force. At the beginning of this exercise regimen, you start out with 100, you start out at a given level of strength, and you exercise that muscle 15 minutes a day for 12 weeks, and what do you get? You get quite a bit stronger. Now, if you do that experiment again and instruct participants to think about moving the abductor digiti minimi for 15 minutes a day for 12 weeks, you get 30% stronger. You get a physical increase in strength by thinking about moving your hand. So there's a fascinating literature about how your brain can change as you redirect your attention. Which brings me to my job. I'm a psychiatrist, and I do psychotherapy. Psychotherapy is one of the sadly fading parts of psychiatry, given the economy and how psychiatrist reimbursement works, but again, that's another lecture. For this lecture, psychotherapy is an amazing thing. It's kind of radical. You think, okay, on the one hand, okay, pills make sense. That, okay, you've got a brain disorder, I'm going to give you a chemical that changes the other chemicals in your brain, and you get better. That makes sense, right? In psychotherapy, I'm not touching you, hopefully. I'm not making physical contact with you other than the vibrations between us in the air. I'm speaking words. And over the course of those speaking of words, you change, you heal, you get better, which is weird. Why is that happening? All that's happening really, material, is an information transfer or information exchange. And so you might say, okay, well, we know that drugs work, but what about psychotherapy? This is a meta-analysis, 52 different studies, including 3,600 people. And when you add psychotherapy to medications, you get additive effects. It's not just that they're each doing some sort of effect, that they work in different ways. From the bottom up with the medications and from the top down with psychotherapy, which is very, very interesting to think that these things work together better than they work alone. And this part's not controversial. Like there's a lot of things that we might be presenting or saying that are like, okay, that's kind of out there, but psychiatrists, the practice guidelines, everybody more or less agrees this is what we do and believe in psychotherapy. But just pausing to think about what does that mean? Now, the other thing that this means is that there are clinical changes, but what about brain changes? This, I believe, is the first demonstration of a brain change as the consequence of a pharmacologic intervention in a patient group. This is 1996, which is, again, like this is within my lifetime that this has been discovered, that you actually get brain changes. Won't go into the details, but there are places in the brain that before and after change that are indicated on the diagram there. And this has been replicated in this is an OCD, but there's other conditions, depression and anxiety and schizophrenia. I mean, there's all manner of changes that you see in the brain and a variety of psychotherapies. Now, okay, so this gets us to who cares. Now, I've given you a lot of information, but why does this matter? And I'm going to turn this a little bit personal in this section. Okay, so one correlational study, or a review of correlational studies, shows that people who believe in free will there's more helpfulness, better work performance, higher job satisfaction, increased passionate love, higher life satisfaction, lower stress levels, and a more punitive attitude towards wrongdoers. If you don't believe in free will, there's more dishonest behavior, more selfish behavior, more conforming behavior, reduced helpfulness, less learning from one's misdeeds, less thinking for oneself, and, worst of all, less recycling. So, one thing that, and this is a correlational study, so this is not terribly strong data, and there's a handful of these things that they've done randomized trials that have been challenged and debated. It's an interesting question, but the overall idea that concerns me is: are we abdicating our ability to choose? If we don't believe we can choose, are we abdicating our ability to choose to other people? Are we outsourcing that? Are we giving this thing that we have, this treasure, up to someone else, whether it be a corporation or a mass movement or somebody that's not us? And sometimes that can be good or that has advantages, but we have to think very carefully about doing that. And switching gears to my own concerns and my own work, mental health, there's mental health consequences too, or there at least statistically some evidence of that. This is teen suicide rates, or at least attempts in a particular study, showing that you get a pretty significant increase in risk of suicidal attempt with injury if you have a low self-efficacy. That means I have a low belief in my ability to change or do things in the world. And so this is not like yes or no philosophically. This is a psychological construct. This is a psychological experience, which I think that another aspect of free will and the ability to choose is. And this fits in with this. This is something I deal with regularly. This is one construct of what leads to suicide. These three: I am alone, I am a burden, I'm not afraid to die. And that leads to higher risk for suicide. And I think that one of the things that tends to happen is these things tend to be fixed when you get depressed and you believe that I am a burden and I will always be a burden. I am a burden and I have no ability to change. I am a burden and that is the only way I could possibly see myself. And that's tragic. And that is a belief that's sort of psychological, sort of beyond the philosophy, that really matters, but is connected to it. This is a book by David Burns, an influential psychotherapist. He says, nearly all depressed people are convinced that they are facing some special, awful truth about themselves and the world that their terrible feelings are absolutely realistic and inevitable. But he says, you can learn to change the way you think about things, and you can also change your basic values and beliefs. And when you do, you will often experience profound and lasting changes in your mood, outlook, and productivity. This is Irv Yalom, another Stanford guy who talks about psychotherapy. A very influential guy. He says this: we don't talk about freedom in psychotherapy, but he says, though the word freedom is not found in the psychotherapist's lexicon, the concept of freedom plays an indispensable role in both theory and practice of all traditional and innovative psychotherapies. And more challenging and more difficult for me as a therapist. Until one realizes that one has created one's own dysphoria, there can be no motivation to change. Which brings us back to the couch. This idea that we can change, that we can make changes to who we are and to what we're doing in our own lives and in the lives of the people around us. And that belief that we can change, at least some degree of change. And this doesn't deny that there's trauma, that there's pain, that there's cultural influences, that there's really bad circumstances that people are in. But I think that ultimate, there's nothing I can do. That is the thing that a big part of my day-to-day is wrestling through. And this, ending on sort of my calling to this is a passage from the Bible that really touched me and really influences my view of kind of what I see myself as trying to contribute to. The prophet Isaiah says, "The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me," which ultimately gets taken up to be to refer to Jesus. "The Spirit of the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to those who are bound." And that's what people often are, psychologically bound, bound by their past, bound by their false beliefs, bound by all sorts of things. And I think this is a beautiful picture from a movie that came out a few years ago of freedom. And this is something that just has touched me so deeply, that people are losing this ability to think that they're free, the freedom of a child to ice skate around a frozen lake. This is something that is profoundly beautiful and profoundly good, is human ability to choose. And it's something that I hope for all of you, and I hope for myself, and I hope for everybody, is that we would choose more things and take into our lives and our ability more than we previously had. So that's the end of my section.
Thank you, David, for that beautiful talk. I think very thoughtful and very moving. I've been told that people in the upstairs overflow area are having a hard time hearing, so I'm going to try to hold this closer to my mouth, but if it starts ringing and being unpleasant in here, we'll go back to the status quo ante. So let's see, let's get me up here. So I'll be talking about some issues in science and faith, and I sort of want to start from this point of view that David has touched on, that there's a wide perception in the general public and among students at universities like yourselves that science and faith are somehow in conflict. And I want to ask, is that true? And I want to distinguish between the findings of science, the actual discoveries, and certain assumptions of science. And my argument here is that there need to be no tension between religion and the discoveries of science, but tension can occur between religion and working assumptions of everyday science, especially when these assumptions are elevated to the status of an all-encompassing ideology. And I'll have more to say about that as I go along. And then the last part of the talk is going to be about neuroscience. I'll get into the brain and talk about causality and more about this free will problem that David has started us on so elegantly. So I don't have time to talk about all three of these. I'm just going to make a comment on the first one, that in terms of discoveries of science, things like the Big Bang, about the theory of evolution, about, some of you may have heard these things about the anthropic principle. I find all of these actually quite consonant with my beliefs as a Christian. You may have to be willing to adjust your timescales in the first chapter of Genesis and some of your literal interpretations, but you can do that without doing any violence to the key spiritual insights. And that's all I'm going to say. If anyone wants to raise those issues in the Q&A or afterwards, I'd be happy to elaborate on them more. So what I think is that this tension can occur between religion and the assumptions of science. And here's kind of the notion, some of which is completely true. So science is experiment-based, it's precise, it's objective when it's working well, and it's transferable across communities and cultures. It has a certain third-person aspect to it that David alluded to, in the sense that discoveries made in my lab should be reproducible to anywhere in the world for anyone who has the right equipment and sort of conceptual background. In contrast, religion is more holistic. It has a greater dependence on intuition, and it requires commitment in the absence of proof. And I think these are, in general, true. I think these are not black and white distinctions between science and religion, but in terms of matters of degree, I think these are true. And so when I discuss sort of my own religious faith and commitment with some of my colleagues or students in my lab, or, as I did one day over lunch with a postdoc in my lab, my postdoc winds up saying in the end, after we talk about a lot of these things, he says, why go there, to the religion bit? Why not just stick with science? He said, Bill, this is so different from your normal way of thinking. Which of course he meant in the lab. And when I'm discussing scientific results, I have extremely high standards of what I admit to the canon of what I believe to be true about the world. He said, why not just stick with science? And this kind of reflects an extra scientific assumption, and I want to really highlight this because it's important. And that extra scientific assumption, which is frequently made, is that science is the only path, or perhaps the best path, to reliable knowledge about the world. And that's where a lot of tension comes in. That's where some people seem to feel like you have to make a choice between science and faith. And I emphatically don't think that's true. So why don't I think that's true? Well, here's the core of this part of the talk, is that the religious mode of thought, or I might just say the personal mode of thought and belief, is normal and necessary mode of evaluation and decision-making in real life for all of us. Scientists, non-scientists, religious, non-religious, it doesn't matter. And the key point is this, that the most important questions in life are not susceptible to solution by the scientific method. The most important questions in life, I'll say again, you can't go into the lab and do a bunch of experiments and get answers to them. So you say, well, what kinds of questions? Well, here's one that I think is important, and most of you will agree. Is it better to live or to die? And in a room this large, there will be some people for whom that's been a live issue in David's practice. For many people, it's a live issue, and virtually all of us in the room will have known a friend or a family member for whom this has been a live issue. And there is no scientific program or scientific agenda that you can undertake to get an answer to this question, yet it's an existential, important question that we have to answer, some of us every day. So a second question that I would points up to this is this question, that might be relevant for some of you, I don't know. Should I marry this person? Okay, should I put my life together with this person for what we both hope will be a lifetime? And if you sit around waiting for a scientific answer to that question, you are never going to get married, okay? That's just, I hate to be the one to break this to you, but that's just the truth. These kinds of questions, should I uproot my family and move from the East Coast to the West Coast and all of their situations and lives and stages of development of children, et cetera, you don't get multiple shots at this. You have one shot at answering this question and trying to get it right. So I would say that this religious quest involves the same sort of reasoning as the marriage example. Now, it doesn't mean, and I want to say this emphatically also, this does not mean that we check our brains at the door. Okay, that's another canard that's occasionally put up by, is arguing against religious faith. You check your brain at the door. There are sources of evidence, and we have to think about them as hard as possible. But in the end, this evidence is not compelling in a scientific sense, and faith accompanied by commitment is essential. And the stakes are high. Okay, the stakes are high in the marriage example. Maybe they're even higher in the religious quest example. You might get in touch with the most meaningful aspect of reality in our universe, or you might make a fool of yourself, okay, and waste a lot of years and a lot of time. The stakes are high. So simply put, I think this is the human condition. It is life, and our most consequential decisions in life have little or nothing to do with science, and this is true for everyone, including scientists. So I think that for all of us, the real question is this: is there an ultimate source of meaning and value in the universe? And if so, what is it? So just to summarize, there's no deep conflict between my faith and the actual findings of science. Where tension does occur is occasionally about the assumptions of everyday working science, and especially when those assumptions are elevated to an ideology about what's possible or not possible to know about the world. Okay, so that's sort of the first part of the talk and the remarks that I wanted to make. But what about the brain? This guy's a neuroscientist up here, and he's, trying to pretend like he's practicing philosophy without a license. But all of us have to do that just to get out of bed in the morning, right? We have to. So let's talk about the brain a little bit, and I'll pursue the themes that David has started to lay down. And I think among professional neuroscientists and graduate students, you don't ask this question. It's usually an undergraduate in a classroom who will raise their hand, when we're talking about the brain basis of emotion and visual perception and decision making, and somebody will raise their hand and say, well, what about free will? Okay, professional neuroscientists don't tend to ask this kind of question. My first off kind of flip answer to this is I'm not a fatalist, but even if I were, what could I do about it? That's a quote from someone. I don't remember where I got that, but that's not original with me, but it's funny. Okay, so what I think is that we all want to get to some sort of, when we talk about freedom and free will, we want to get to some sort of notion that we have some level of control over our actions. And I would put it this way succinctly. I would say that my behavior is caused at least in part by my beliefs, my values, my memories, my goals, and my aspirations. Now, I say that acknowledging that much of our behavior is not caused by those things that we desire. Much of our behavior is caused by cultural biases that we're not even aware of, by family of origin biases and shaping, by childhood traumas that we're only dimly aware of, if at all. But at least some part of it, in order to have a meaningful understanding of freedom, our choices have to be governed by our highest values and our aspirations. So I want to put a corollary on here, is that conscious, rational thought plays a causal role in my behavior. So there is a tendency in some circles to think of consciousness and the conscious narratives we have about our reasons for choosing things and doing things. It's just froth. It's epiphenomenal. It's froth on the top of a wave. It has no real causal power. It's just narratives that we tell ourselves to try to make sense of the world. But I actually think that consciousness plays a causal role in my behavior, and we can talk about that. The most clear example is this matter of bringing unconscious biases into consciousness. If somebody shows me papers that I've graded over a 10-year period, and I'm systematically discriminating against some group, whether it's gender or ethnic or regional accent, how well you speak English, whatever, there was a bias in my behavior that I wasn't even aware of, presumably. But I can't do anything about that bias until I become conscious of it, okay? And that's really critical. It's only when you become aware of the things that are driving your behavior and your choices that suddenly it opens the playing field. It opens a degree of freedom to make different choices than you have in the past. And that's a key causal role for consciousness. And in talking about this self-determination, as a neuroscientist, trying to puzzle about beliefs and values and memories and goals. Some of those things we've made progress on in neuroscience, especially memory, I think. But many of the rest of these remain mysterious. But the key issue that we need to get down to is what counts as a cause, okay? And getting into this, I think I'll lean on an observation that was made by Carl Craver, notably a neurophilosopher who's at Washington University, St. Louis, but others as well. And the observation here is that neuroscience explanation is intrinsically multi-level. Okay, so it's not good enough. There is no level of explanation for behavior that's fundamental, and when we get to that fundamental level, we're going to throw away all the other levels. So let's deal with an example right here. So I'm going to just take you into the mind of a neuroscientist or neuroscience just for a few minutes here. So here's an example of something that neuroscientists like to study. It's long-term spatial memory. And long-term spatial memory is what you rely on to find your car in a parking lot like this. Okay? Frequently, I can't even remember which parking lot I parked the car in, much less how to find it. But many people are actually very good at this sort of thing, long-term spatial memory, and neuroscientists would like to know, how does that work? How does it work in the brain? And the very first thing that neuroscientists do is they take this general problem in psychology and they reduce it to a situation that you can actually study in a lab. So frequently that is a mouse navigating a water maze. So you train the mouse to navigate a maze that can be on dry land, or the mouse can be swimming in the water, and that's your operationalization of spatial memory. But then you say, well, how does the mouse manage to do these tricks reliably? And one of the things that we've discovered at the next lower level is that there's a structure in the mouse brain and our brains called the hippocampus that actually functions as sort of a little GPS and is really critical for this ability to do spatial navigation. And some of you will know that a Nobel Prize was won for that work, or awarded for that work, about 5 years ago. But you say, well, how does this map get formed in the hippocampus? And when you put an animal in a new environment, how does a new map get formed? And the answer in part is that at the cellular level, this phenomenon called long-term potentiation is a mechanism for changing the strength of synapses in the hippocampus and elsewhere in the brain. So the strength of synapses, that is the communication joint between one neuron and the next neuron, those can be regulated upward or they can be regulated downward, and this LTP phenomenon is critical to the establishment of new long-term memories. But how does long-term potentiation actually work? Well, it turns out there are molecules at synapses lying in the cell membrane called NMDA receptors, and these receptor molecules are really critical for long-term potentiation. But you say, well, how do those NMDA receptors get there? And the answer is that that process is controlled by expression of genes in the nerve cells. And so you have at least 6 levels we've identified here in the study of spatial memory and its neural mechanisms. And an important thing to realize is that all of these levels are actually essential. There is no level that has fundamental privilege. Now, I know neuroscientists who believe that genes are the fundamental level of explanation. They're genetic fundamentalists, okay? I know other neuroscientists who believe that the synaptic plasticity is the fundamental level of explanation, and they have a different one. But the reality is all of these are important. And of course, we could go all the way down here to chemical bonds and physics, and we could go up higher in this hierarchy, up to societies and how we solve traffic problems. But I think the heart of the explanation about spatial memory lies right in here. But importantly, all of these levels are critical. And I've drawn these arrows, sort of arrows of causality in both directions. And what they mean is that neuroscientists, the whole way we can identify a mechanism like this in the first place is because we can manipulate one level, like the hippocampus, and we can show that long-term potentiation changes. Or we can manipulate long-term potentiation. We can produce knockout mice who have very little long-term potentiation, and then the spatial maps in the hippocampus change quite dramatically. So the key point is that we can manipulate at any given level of the system and have effects on downward levels, or you can manipulate here and have effects upward. And that's how we know, that's what we do in the lab every day. That's how we know we're dealing with a mechanism. If you manipulate one of these and you affect the hippocampus, but you manipulate the hippocampus and you have no effect on long-term potentiation, then you start to suspect you don't have a mechanism after all. You've been chasing a false hypothesis. And this mutual manipulation between levels is really important, I think, and this is a little advertisement for Carl Craver's book, which is conveniently entitled Explaining the Brain. He talks about multi-level mechanistic explanation in neuroscience. And I have this nice quote here from Carl, and he talks about this concept of mutual manipulability. And he says, a part is a component in a mechanism if one can change the behavior of the mechanism as a whole by intervening to change the component, and one can change the behavior of the component by intervening to change the behavior of the mechanism as a whole. And he calls this making a difference. And that's what we care about as scientists in the lab, is making a difference. So I don't think this is sort of philosophical word games. I think he's onto something here that maps onto my experience in the lab. Now, I can see some thought bubbles over some heads out there and say, you know, what does all of this mean? Why is he talking to me about this long-term spatial memory stuff? I lost track of what's at stake here. So let's go back a couple of slides and say the key meaningful concept of freedom, I think, is this issue of self-determination, autonomy and responsibility, and the key issue being what counts as a cause. And the core observation is that all of those levels of explanation are necessary to account for something like long-term spatial memory. There's none of them that are dispensable. So how that cashes out for me is that it means that my beliefs, my actions, my values, which I think are higher order configurations of nervous system, they're patterns of activity at the highest levels of the central nervous system, and they count as causes. And I see no problem with believing that, thinking that. In fact, I see every motivation to embrace that from the point of view of neuroscience. So if we can find a way to talk meaningfully about non-fundamental causation, and I think we have to, then we can take mental causation seriously, and I think personal responsibility for our choices seriously. So note that I'm not making an argument here about any extra material substance or anything. I would put myself in David's category of a non-reductionist materialist. I'm a materialist. I don't postulate any extra substances. I think an aspiration, a belief, a goal, as I said, is a higher order configuration of neural activity. But I think those higher order configurations are part of the causal story of our behavior. Now, one other little caveat here. This is not to say that bottom-up causes are unimportant. I emphatically don't believe that. Explanatory relevance, remember from that figure, it runs up and down, okay, all the way up and down the hierarchy. And I'll just echo this slide, which you saw before in David's talk, which shows that there is overwhelming scientific evidence now that the best treatment for really serious depression is a combination of antidepressant drugs and psychotherapy, which is frequently cognitive behavioral therapy. And our patients do better on those two together, on average, than they do on either alone. And I think that this scientific finding that David introduced to you says a lot about who we are as human beings. The antidepressant drugs are a classic bottom-up intervention. You're going way down the system, several levels down to the level of neurotransmitters and receptors, and you're turning knobs there, okay? And patients get better with that kind of knob. That knob is onto reality of who we are as humans. But cognitive behavioral therapy or other kinds of therapy are top-down interventions. They actually aim to change a patient's beliefs or patterns of interaction with the world. So here is a knob that's up here at a very high level, and we're trying to turn that knob without any particular regard to neurotransmitters or receptor molecules in the brain. And the fundamental fact from this clinical insight that's come from David's field, psychiatry, is that cognitive restructuring is possible from therapy. Cognitive restructuring is the goal of cognitive behavioral therapy. And it means that beliefs matter in the end, that we as human beings are both. It's bottom up is not sufficient to tell our story, and top down alone is not sufficient to tell our story. We are both, and your beliefs matter. And I think that the beliefs mattering is the key to understanding autonomy and acquiring a scientifically insightful and personally satisfying notion of freedom. And I'll say that understanding the nature of human freedom is the most consequential problem facing the neurobehavioral sciences. I really believe that. Some days I think, no, curing Alzheimer's is the most important problem. for the long run, I really think that understanding freedom is the most consequential thing. And it's important for obvious reasons of human dignity, social responsibility, but it's also important for science itself, because science is fundamentally based on the notion that we have a freedom to choose. We have a freedom to conclude one thing about what's going on in the world or a different thing, depending on the evidence and the quality of evidence. And if we dismiss that as scientists, then we cut off the very ground, the intellectual limb that we're standing on, and the result will be intellectual freefall. So this understanding that I'm trying to promote here of neuroscience and mind and matter doesn't prove anything religiously. This is a Veritas forum. We're trying to speak truth to each other, and it's motivated in part to have a dialogue about Christian worldview and religious worldviews in general. And I've had something to say about that tonight, but the free will business, I'm trying to come to an accurate, truthful understanding of what we're about as humans. And what I've said here doesn't prove anything religiously, but, and this is important, I think that this view is open to a holistic and profoundly religious view of the human person and our quest for meaning in this universe. So I'm going to stop there, and we will move on to the question and answer session.
I love his quote at the end. I just want to read it back as we move on to our Q&A. Understanding the nature of human freedom is the most consequential problem facing the neurobehavioral sciences. What a rich quote. We're going to go into a time of question and answer. And to get us started in that, I'm going to introduce to you Dr. Jit Muthuswamy. If you can come on up, where are you? There you are. Jit is an associate professor here at ASU in the School of Biological and Health Systems Engineering. He is the PI of the Neural Microsystems Lab, and focuses on developing technologies for interfacing and modulating the function of neurons in the central and peripheral nervous system. And so I'm going to invite you guys to come on back up, and we've asked Jed if he would ask a couple of questions that he would get from his students frequently related to the talk from Bill and David. And then as those questions are being asked, if you want to go ahead and send your questions in, we'll start asking those as well.
Thank you, Hannah. Really interesting talk, both David and Bill. I want a couple of instances, and I want to run this by you and see what you think about it and help us perhaps deal with this issue a little better. So as we've been doing this science, and my lab, I've been doing this primarily neural engineering work and do some science. And at every stage of the work, whether it's identifying the problem, setting up the hypothesis, designing the experiments, making the measurements, getting the data, analyzing the data, at no stage have I ever experienced a conflict with my Christian faith and with what I'm doing. Yet, I have instances when students come up to me and ask very gently, you are a man of faith, how is it that you do science? And to me it's puzzling why that, and I saw the data you put up that a majority of the scientists don't necessarily believe in it, but there are students on campus who wrestle with this. My problem was in trying to, first of all, it was a surprise to me. I didn't know where to start, what to say. And the content is there in my mind saying, I know the answer, but I don't know how to communicate to that student. And I basically asked the student, where is this coming from? And trying to understand why do you even ask that question. Apparently in some verbal and non-verbal ways, she has got that impression primarily from the labs she's been working in, and particularly in life sciences, seems to be a mindset in some ways that's communicated in a variety of different ways. Whether it's verbal or not, I do not know, but it's there. And so my question to you is, as a faculty, how do I effectively communicate to students and even other faculty colleagues and have a dialogue with them?
I think that's an excellent question, and I think that the approach is, I think, right on, which is ask the person their story. What is it that led to this particular belief, as far as is consciously accessible, and then I think there's raising questions about what are things that the person might not have thought about. That's something that, of course, is bread and butter to psychiatry, is trying to find what are other causes, either from the top, say, society, or from below of, maybe fears or subconscious, things that are bubbling up that might influence one way or another. And I think it's an excellent question that also has broader societal implications of how is it that we come to believe what we believe? I think it makes me think of the work of Jonathan Haidt, who wrote a book called Righteous Mind, where he talks about all sorts of non-rational influences to how we make decisions, about how we make decisions is often influenced by all sorts of things, which on a day-to-day basis I deal with. But I think that one of the things that's helpful is just to know that whoever it is that said that is in the minority, that this is not something that most people believe in as social creatures. Just that fact alone, I think, disarms a lot of the fear, as well as, I think, the philosophical things that are very interesting. The debate is very interesting and very long.
So if I could just add one word. First of all, as David says, you've taken the first step already. The fact that the student feels free to even ask that question of you is a very significant step in a good direction. And the further step is to try to find out if they're perceiving some conflict between, the findings of science, either the Big Bang or evolution or whatever it might be, or whether it's about this epistemological thing, how you accept things to be true, and figure out which problem you're dealing with, and then sort of address them. And the epistemological question, then I really try to go home to the thing I went to in my talk, that this sort of faith and commitment leading to long-term knowledge, that sort of thing is useful. And I'll tell you one other story about this. I have a colleague in my department who's a grumpy atheist or an antagonistic atheist. And if any of you who have been to Stanford know, there's this beautiful church at the center of campus, Romanesque thing Mrs. Stanford built and loved greatly. And my colleague said to me one day, that church should be blown up. This was before 9/11, by the way. He said, that church should be blown up. It's a monument to irrationality, and it has no place on a college campus, a university campus. So, that was my little conversation in the hallway, right? And, I'm grasping how do you sort of deal with this in a short, succinct way. And I said, look, if you want to get rid of irrational behavior, you should first bomb my home. Because, getting married and having children was the most irrational thing I've ever done in my life. And that's a little flippant, but there's a point there too, right? Sequestering off religious faith into some prohibited area of human activity and knowledge, while not realizing that all of us have to make those very same steps and commitments and use non-scientific ways of knowing, that's just a really egregious mistake. And that I keep coming to that over and over again.
Do you want to ask your second
Yeah,
question?
so the other question is, again, an application question here. Among students, the one common denominator, not just students, among everyone, the common denominator is suffering, different kinds, and you take a feeling of, it could be guilt or pain, and I know religion offers, and our Christian faith offers a way out in the person and the message of Jesus Christ, but when a student has an experience of guilt or a pain or a rejection of some kind, if they are, and I'm going to post this in a slightly awkward way in a bit, but nonetheless, the point is that the student sometimes has to think twice about taking a religious pathway, saying, well, this is not scientific, it all sounds a little weird to me, even though ideas such as confession or repentance or changing ways or sound a little strange. Oh, it's not scientific. Do you think there's any evidence that yet, or that in neuroscientific research that would actually contradict or conflict with any of these religious experiences? So the student, that would prevent a student from actually considering that as a religious way.
It's also a great question, and I think there's that assumption that there is some sort of conflict practically about believing in that, and something else that's a thread there that religion will sort of palliate the pain, or that everybody suffers, but those who maybe if you sort of go to religion, you'll suffer less, or if you go to Christianity, you'll suffer less. But I think the first comment I'll make is theological, which is, I mean, it seems like Jesus talks a lot about suffering more, that you're going to experience persecution, and just get ready for it because it's going to be really hard. And so that there's sort of, okay, there's that aspect of it, but I think the evidence that we have, in at least epidemiologically, looking at people who are religious, it's pretty good. I mean, the outcomes are pretty good. It does seem that people who are religious have better, higher rankings in neighborliness, and they donate more money, and they donate more blood, and more acts of random kindness, and their the rates of depression risk of developing depression is lower. The rates of suicide are lower, threefold for Protestants, and I think something like 15-fold. It's gigantic lower for Catholics. There's just really, but these are all correlational studies, because we don't randomize people to church, and there are some people who are talking about that. Why not randomize people? We randomize people to all sorts of caustic chemicals. Why not church? Like, what's the worst that could happen? I don't know. So it's an interesting question do we have direct evidence that religion is against mental health? No, it seems like the correlations are in the positive direction, but it's hard to interpret those. But I think the more profound question is that no, I think that I don't think that this is that there is a conflict, even practically, between religious faith. There is no reason neuroscientifically or psychiatrically why you would, though of course there's all sorts of bad reasons why people would go to religion to escape, or in fact, everybody goes to religion for bad reasons. Everybody goes to everything for bad reasons. We're all a mixture of motivations. So I think that's the other aspect here too.
All right, thank you so much. So we have our first question from you, and it's how do we distinguish mental illness from something spiritual? How do we distinguish mental illness from something spiritual?
That's a really good question that I really wish we had more research on. I mean, honestly, I don't know of collaborations between, there's not much collaboration between the chaplain and the psychiatrist, and that's a problem. So I really wish we did have more exploration of that, and I think that there's all sorts. That question can go a lot deeper in terms of how to help people who believe that their suffering is that way. That also is another thing. There's plenty of people from a religious background that are told, well, you're not depressed, you just don't have enough faith. You need to pray harder. It's like, well, no, look, this is a neurobiological condition called major depressive disorder. And okay, maybe there are spiritual components, but let's try Prozac. I mean, there's... So, I mean, that doesn't mean that some things might not be, because, like, look, I'm losing my faith, and I could tell you all sorts of stories of patients that that the religious loss of faith or believing something new is a really significant component in the depression or the anxiety or the suicidality. I mean, these are enormous questions, but I think that there does tend to be a tendency on both sides on the one hand, to say spirituality doesn't have anything to do with it, and on the other to say you need to pray your mental illness away, which, by all means, pray about it, but don't forget that we also have medicines and psychotherapies and such.
I'd just make one comment on that. I mean, there are some data out there that David knows much better than I do from his clinical practice, but there are brain diseases like temporal lobe epilepsy, where a fairly common concomitant or symptom of that is hyper-religiosity. So people who have had no particular religious involvement before suddenly become deeply convinced that they have a personal relationship with God, and they can't actually avoid telling you that, even though they know it might seem a little weird or suspicious. So, there are some brain conditions in which religiosity can probably go awry. But as David said in his talk, there are also brain conditions in which vision can go awry. And there are brain conditions in which love can go awry. And there are brain conditions in which nationalism and patriotism can go awry. And the fact that it can go awry in disease is no indicator of the truth of the matter in brain health. And that's a critical thing to keep in mind.
Excellent, thank you. I wonder, with your image up of the medication and the psychotherapy couch, if you would also say, as those have an interaction impact, if how spiritual life might also be another factor in the top-down and bottom-up as well.
I mean, it is really interesting that some of the emerging psychotherapy, some of the newer psychotherapies are more influenced, let's say, by an Eastern perspective or by a more contemplative tradition. So mindfulness is being incorporated more explicitly into things like dialectical behavioral therapy or acceptance and commitment therapy. So I think that's being woven in to certain therapies. But again, I really wish we had more people working on that, more experience in that domain.
I'll be quiet. Next question.
Okay. So next question, how do you explain feeling the presence of God with neuroscience?
So, just first of all, an observation. And I'd be interested actually to hear David's comment on this, because this might be a place where David and I diverge a bit. What I call the central dogma of neuroscience is that all of our experience, mental, emotional, spiritual, is inextricably linked to the biology of the brain. And I think that anything that's real in our behavior and in our experience is definitely going to have brain concomitants and brain causation, just like that sort of up and down pathway that I drew up there. So I think that it's almost a foregone conclusion that things like powerful conversion experiences or things like a transcendent sense of God's presence, there will be changes in the brain in there. Now, how you interpret that is a different question altogether. I do have colleagues. I study vision, by the way. That's been virtually my entire career, and I have colleagues who talk about illusions of conscious will, conscious control in careful experiments where they can show that they can fool subjects into believing they have conscious control over the movement of a cursor, but in fact the experimentalist is moving it subtly. And they talk about the illusion of conscious will and write books about it. But we have illusions in vision too. We have visual illusions, but we don't go writing books about the illusion of vision. I mean, we might write books about visual illusions, but not the illusion of vision. So again, I think that there will be brain concomitants of spiritual experience. I have no idea what they are. No idea. Somebody asked me in an audience 2 weeks ago, to explain the conversion experience in neurobiological terms, and I was like, whoa. I'm still working on visual motion and simple forms of decision making. But I don't doubt that it's there, but I don't feel threatened by that. But I want to hear what David says to this.
Yeah, so I think that I am of the opinion, I think I agree on the correlation while on Earth. I mean, that every time there's going to be something that we experience on Earth, there's going to be some sort of brain signal there. And I think that to go beyond that is going to take scripture or some sort of revealed text or some sort of experience beyond that. I mean, there's some people working on the out-of-body experiences. So, I mean, I don't know if that would be an example if that research actually proved that you could have some sort of extra perception without a brain working or something. That might be something, but I don't know. Like, I think that I am inclined to believe that there is a perfect correlation while on Earth, but it does seem like there is my reading of scriptures, it seems like there's some sort of disembodied state before, between death and the resurrection, but I wouldn't go there with neuroscience, and I wouldn't even say that that would ever actually happen while, before death. But, what about that middle state? Like, I don't have, I don't have a lot of confidence about what that's going to be or if that's, if I'm reading scripture right when it comes to that interpretation. In terms of the experience of God, I'd say that there is some interesting stuff that was maybe not too surprising. When imaging people while they're praying, or imaging people while they're speaking in tongues, or imaging people in these various states, and I mean, more or less goes what you'd expect. Like, if you ask somebody when they're speaking in tongues, is this a rational state, or are you very emotional? They say, well, I'm very emotional, and sure enough, like, the emotional centers in the brain are more active, and the rational centers are less active. Like, I mean, that's, what else would it be? Like, so I mean, I think that this is, of course, the person is using their brain, or maybe, of course, to me, the brain is at least present for the event. Whether or not there's some other thing that's happening, I don't know. But at very least, there's correlations in the brain with what's happening that make sense on a superficial level.
Right, thank you. Next question, does science require faith? Why?
Yeah, so I put that contrast up there between science and religion, right? And I emphasize that religion requires more faith or commitment in the absence of compelling evidence. But there certainly are major examples of that in science. So, I mean, just a commonplace for all of us who do science, we have to have faith in the regularity of the world, the general regularity. Otherwise, we'd have no reason to think an experiment we do this month can be replicated in our own labs next month. So that basic level of faith is there, but there's more than that. So if you look at the history of Copernicus, who had a fundamentally revolutionary view of the organization of the solar system, and believed it all his life amidst great persecution and convinced very few people during his lifetime, there was a lot of gut level faith there that he was right, and that he was on to truth that most people just weren't picking up on. And there are examples of this in the modern era. There's a colleague of mine, a neuroscientist, Stan Prisner at UCSF, who basically validated experimentally the prion notion of infectious transmission of disease. Prions are little proteins, and the dogma before Prisner is that disease was transmitted by bacteria, by viruses, but certainly not by simple molecules like proteins. And yet he proved over the course of 10 or 15 years that prion infection was a real thing, and he won the Nobel Prize for it eventually. But he was roundly ridiculed. I mean, he was mocked at scientific conferences about proposing that these proteins, transmitted disease. So he had a real gut level conviction. That's a good religious term for you, conviction. That he was right, that he was on to truth, and it does require faith like that. And I really admire scientists. I don't know that I don't think I've ever been like that in my career. I've never been that far on the outside of the consensus and been proven to be right.
Thank you. Next.
I'll add one more thought to that. I think it was J.P. Moreland in one of his books cites, I forget the name of the person, but there's at least 10 assumptions that science makes in anything they study that's foundational to science. It's not provable by science, but those are assumptions that we make. That one of them Bill mentioned was that there is a natural order out there in the world that has to be discovered, that there is a truth out there. That's an assumption we make. And so there's 10 such assumptions that science makes when you in this process.
Thank you. Thank you. Next, how does science deepen your faith and understanding of God?
Well, I think because it's fun. I mean, I think that there's it makes me think of Eric Liddell, Chariots of Fire, how God made me fast, and when I run, I feel his pleasure. And that there's something, okay, like what is the brain of Eric Little doing when he's running? Is it like, does his soul go somewhere else and like his body's, no, he's like, it's right there. He's like, he's running a race and he's just, but there's this degree of pleasure. And I've always liked that, I think that's the Westminster Confession, that the what is the duty of man or something like that, and it's to glorify God and enjoy him forever. And that pleasure is very, very close to the center, and I think that finding something that God has made us to do, or something God has made me to do, and there are certain things that, partly that's science and partly that's other things, but when I do that, that's great. And is it like a transcendent experience? Not usually. Not with science, no. It hasn't been some sort of supernatural thing or something that I would say, that's a transcendent experience for sure. But it's fun.
And not only is it fun, it can be really beautiful. And again, that doesn't prove anything religiously, but being fun, being impressed with beauty, being awestruck at grandeur, those are experiences in science that have very close concomitants in religious faith. And they can be, I think, very close cousins to each other and enhance each other.
Constantly be proved wrong. We take simple things and try it out in the lab, and it doesn't seem to work the way we want it to work. And there's always a very different explanation than what we started out with. And that's the wonder and beauty of science that we constantly see in the labs.
Wow. Constantly being able to be proved wrong through science. Nice.
Yeah, if you don't want to be proved wrong, do not sign up to be a scientist.
We probably just have time for one last question, which is, how do you deal with doubt in your faith?
Some of you may be familiar with the writings of Frederick Buechner, and if you're not, I highly recommend him. He's probably my favorite Christian author. The last name is spelled Buechner, and a good starting point is his little book called Wishful Thinking, which is a series of essays on sort of religious topics, and he has a knack for rendering them true in experience, sort of outside the religious trappings. And he has a little essay on doubt in there, and I think I can remember most of it for word, or at least parts of it. But he says, doubt is not the opposite of faith. Doubt is a part of faith. Doubt is the ants in the pants of faith. It keeps it alive and moving. And I think faith without doubt has a real danger to drift into smugness. And it's that tension that keeps it real and vibrant for me.
It's a really profound question, and I think that some of the best, deepest, most inspiring work ever produced is people in the throes of doubt. And I think that there's a deep truth to that being with God and the tension, and a lot of people write about that. And I think that the psychological experience of I'm not sure God exists right now isn't one that I've personally had that much, and I know that I'm pretty uncommon in that. Or is God good? I don't quite know what to attribute that to. But there's 100,000 other questions about what is God doing? What does this mean? What is Jesus saying? What does that mean? Is there a soul? Does it exist? Wrestling with these 1,000 other questions while having sort of a core. And I think that picture of marriage is a good one, of faith being much more like marriage than sort of affirmation, or I'm 90% sure I should be married and 10% sure that no, that's not quite the right way to approach it. It's like I've got a relationship, and sometimes it's hard and sometimes it's not. But the doubting, should I be with this person, is not something that I've done with God. Though profoundly respect those who are wrestling with that, and I think the answer practically is, there's all sorts of good resources, as Bill said. Talk to somebody about it. Have a conversation, build a relationship. That's a very important, deep place to be, and I have the utmost respect for those who are in that space.
Well, thank you so much. Let's give him another thank you.